The first 4 presidents. Here we go. We're going to do this in 2 different videos, and then a bonus video for Marbury versus Madison. Stick around. That's an exciting story. So, let's see. We have our Constitution, and everything's good and everything's great. And we figured out the State of Nature Island, and it turns out it's all of the above. Mostly Montesquieu, a little Locke, a little Hobbes, some Rousseau. But we figured it out, and now we got to put it all into action. So let's talk about the United States in 1790, right? Basically, we're all on the East Coast. There's only like 5% of us on the other side of the Appalachians, the Trans-Appalachian people in Ohio and Kentucky and Tennessee. We're all basically still on the East Coast in the original 13 colonies, 13 states now. We have just a couple of cities, only 6 cities are over the population of 8,000 people. The biggest city in the United States in 1790 is Philadelphia. It has 42,000 people, which is about the size of our school district. Not the students, I'm talking about everybody in the school district. So that was the largest city in the United States back then, about the size of our little bitty school district. And there you go. We only have 4 million people in the entire United States at this point, but we're going to continue to double this about every 25 years until we get to a certain point. And here we are sitting at, what, 360 million? So there you go. All right. Getting from point A to point B in 1790, not so easy. You know, from Philadelphia to New York City I just looked it up, is 94.5 miles, right? And so it took an average of 2 days to get from point A to point B. 2 days. Today, 94.5 miles. You get in your car and you're there in an hour and a half. For some of you, faster. But if you're doing this on horse, then it's 2 days. If you're doing that on foot, then let's see, 94 miles. That's what, about 5 days, 6 days walking. The roads are not good. They haven't figured out asphalt yet. They haven't, you know, yeah, it's terrible getting around. So one of the ways, obviously, to get from point A to point B, you use the rivers. And so come down the Ohio River, the Allegheny, the Monongahela, get to the Mississippi River. That's wonderful. The Mississippi River goes a long way. The problem is, we talked about this in a couple films ago, that Spain owns New Orleans, and that's where the Mississippi River empties out. And so Spain was not going to let us go through there without some issues. And so we're going to have to figure that out. The new government's going to have to figure that out. We also have the British, who, you know, we won the treaty, 1783, Treaty of Paris. All right, get out. But we still have some British who are staying in some of the northwest forts on the other side of the Appalachians because they're trading with the Indians and stuff like that. So what are some of the problems that we're facing here as, you know, George Washington walking in the door? We have debts. We got to deal with the defense against the Indians. We need a census to figure out how many people are in all the states so that we can have good voting. We need to organize territories, create courts, regulate trade, establish diplomatic relationships, and ultimately create all of that stuff in the executive branch, which the Constitution lists. So this is not just, oh, okay, ready, go. I mean, we've got to get stuff organized. So how do you do that? First thing you got to do is you got to elect a president. And it was pretty obvious who was going to be the president. I mean, the man, right? The man, George Washington. So he's going to be unanimously elected. Please note, he was not going to be in the very first vote, when they took the straw vote, he was not unanimous. There were a couple people who wanted to vote for John Adams, and John Adams was like, what? No, don't vote for me. Vote for the man. So George Washington was unanimous. John Adams got the second most votes, and so he became vice president, because that's how that happened back then. First place votes is president, second place votes is vice president, which would be really interesting, you know, in the year 2020, the year that I'm filming this, and we're just 4 weeks away from, you know, that'd be kind of interesting. Okay, so George Washington takes over as the president on April 30th of 1789, puts his hand on the Bible, does his thing. Now here's the deal. George Washington always was thinking in the back of his head, or in the front part of his head, I'm setting the precedent to being president. Precedent to be president. So he's setting the standards. He's setting the bar. So everything he does, people are going to go, oh, well, that's how George did it, so therefore, I mean, that's just how it's going to happen. So putting the hand on the Bible to be sworn in. It doesn't say that in the Constitution. You got to have a Bible. It doesn't say that, but all the presidents do because George did. If you look at just his title, people are like, so do we call you, Your Majesty Washington, Your Lordship Washington, whatever? And he said no, or Your Majesty the President, or Your Lordship the President. He said no. You can call me Mr. President. That's it. Mr. President. George Washington was the one who said that, and here we are, 45, about to be 46 presidents later, well, depending on how it goes, 45 presidents later, we're still saying Mr. President. We're not saying His Majesty, we're not saying Your Lordship, we're not saying whatever. George Washington setting the precedent for being president. George Washington has to, according to the Constitution, the president has a cabinet, so he chooses these 4 guys to be part of his cabinet. We have the Secretary of Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. So the Secretary of Treasury, he's the guy who's in charge of, and in the year 2020, we have guys and gals who are in all these roles, but that we're not going to have gals in we're not going to have females in any of these roles for 200 years here. So when I say the guys, I'm not trying to be sexist here. I'm just saying they all were. So we have the guys here, and so we have Secretary of Treasury Alexander Hamilton, and Secretary of Treasury, the person who's supposed to, make some decisions about all the money stuff. We have Secretary of War Henry Knox. You can guess what he does. Secretary of State, so Thomas Jefferson. Secretary of State is the United States' representative to the other countries of the world when it's not the president. So if Washington wants to negotiate a deal with France, he can send Jefferson, and Jefferson can make the deal and sign the bottom line for the United States of America as Secretary of State. So Secretary of State is the most powerful person when it comes to the other countries of the world, not counting the president. And then the Attorney General, Edmund Randolph. Edmund here is, the Attorney General means that he's the highest lawyer, the United States lawyer, that's what I'm trying to say, the lawyer for the United States of America. So if somebody sues the United States and it goes all the way to the Supreme Court, then Edmund Randolph, he's the one that defends the United States of America in court. So it says in the Constitution that Congress must approve of the appointments to the cabinet. And so it's just the Senate just has to approve it. And Washington said, that's fine. However, I want it known that I alone as president can fire people without the approval of the Congress. And that is going to be important later down the road when the Congress is trying to put their people in there to spy on the president or what have you. And the president goes, no, you're fired. Oh, kind of like... Anyway, so there you go. Again, George Washington setting the precedent for being president. We have the Bill of Rights issue. As you recall from last week, the Anti-Federalists, the Democratic Republicans, they're going to argue that they're not going to sign the Constitution. New York, Pennsylvania, they're not going to sign the Constitution unless there's the promise of the Bill of Rights being thrown in there. And so the Bill of Rights is passed. James Madison is the one who writes them all out. He writes like 15 of them. Only 10 of them are passed. Ultimately, a couple others, or at least one more is passed later down the line. But the Big 10 here, and so you have your freedoms of speeches and all, all of that. And when we do government next year, we'll talk all about that. But number 9 and number 10 are pretty important here. Number 9 says, declares specifying rights does not eliminate rights not named. I should say named. That just says that if we didn't write it down, that doesn't mean necessarily that we didn't mean it. And then number 10 says, if we didn't write it down, that means that the states are in charge of it. Like education, like welfare, like jails, like etc. The Constitution says that the Congress will set up the federal court system, and so the Judiciary Act of 1789 was passed, and it set up the federal court system. So we're going to have one Supreme Court. We're going to have, that's in the Constitution, Supreme Court. We're going to have 3 circuit courts and 13 district courts. So these courts are specifically, they're not state courts, they're federal courts. So if there's a question about a treaty, if there's a question about a federal law, if there's a question about here's a federal law and here's a state law and they disagree with each other, those decisions will be made in district court. George Washington wanted that to happen. The Federalists wanted that to happen, so that would give the federal government more power than the state governments. So the Judiciary Act of 1789 is setting up our court system. Alexander Hamilton is Secretary of Treasury. He is going to be incredibly active, and he's going to irritate a lot of people doing this. So his biggest issue, he's got several issues here, but one of the big ones here is that, well, we've got lots of debt. The war cost money, and a lot of states went into debt. A lot of states went into debt to France and to other countries. Remember, they helped us out. And Hamilton said, I've got an idea, guys. I've got an idea. How about this? How about the national government, this brand new national government? We take all the state debts from the war and we absorb them. We take their debt from them. That's an interesting idea. It's an interesting idea. Why? Well, let's look at Hamilton's idea. Let's look at Hamilton's policies. He wants a strong central government. He wants a strong central government, and to do that, we need money. He also is in favor of propping up the wealthy, because his idea, and he writes about it, his idea is that if the wealthy are doing well, they will create more jobs for the poor people. We call that trickle-down economics. We're going to have a lot of presidents who are going to follow this idea. So help the rich out. The rich people will then be able to help the poor people out. Okay, so that's Alexander Hamilton's going to deal with this. And so, how do you help the rich people out? Well, you got to have a strong economy. How do you get a strong economy? Well, Alexander Hamilton says you go into debt. So his plan, absorb all of the debt from the states. And I know you're sitting here thinking, but debt is like a minus on the in the checkbook. How does that help? Okay, well look at this. If you're 30 years old and you want to go buy a house, and you've never gone into debt, you've never gone into debt, you've never had a credit card, you've never had a whatever, you've never gone into debt, and you go up to the bank and you're like, hey, I'd like to buy this $200,000 house, and the bank says, great. Let's look up your credit line, your potential, how well you've done, and you've never had a credit card, you've never had a checking account, you've never had a bank account, the bank's going to go, well, I don't know if we can trust you with $200,000. I don't know how to do that. I don't know if we should do that. You're not a good risk. But let's take that same scenario and say, let's say that you have a credit card, one credit card, and you got that when you're 16 or 17, and you buy gasoline for your car, and that's all you do, and you pay that off every month. You pay it off like clockwork. Well, when you turn 30 and you go up to the bank, and the bank says, well, let's look up your credit history, the bank's going to see that you have paid off all your debt, and they're going to say, you are a good risk. We're going to give you the $200,000. Some of you are thinking, what if I take my credit card and I get a brand new credit card in the mail, and I go down to the 7-Eleven and I buy one icy, and then the next month I pay off my 79 cents, and then I take that credit card and I cut it up. Now check this out. That's an interesting idea, because if you cut it up, then you're not ever going to use it again. Then when you turn 30, here in 15 years, then that's still going to be on your credit. That's going to be on your little ledger on the computer, and the bank's going to go, oh look, you've had this credit card, and you've always paid off your debts. Well, that's true because you only had one debt. Huh. You'd have pretty good credit. That's an interesting way to think about that. Hey, that comes from Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton said, if we can absorb the debts of the states, then, and we pay it off, we're going to look good to Europe. Because then Europe will say, oh, the United States, they're good when it comes to paying back their debt. So it's an interesting argument, right? Go into debt so you'll have better credit. Some states were not very happy about this because they had already paid off their debt, and they're like, whoa, wait, that's not fair. In fact, Virginia argued that they're not going to support this unless we move the capital closer to Virginia and we put it on the Potomac and we call it Washington, D.C. more later. All right. Hamilton said, all right, we're going to do this, and we need a bank. Well, see, we didn't have a bank yet. We had state banks, but we needed a national bank. And why do you need a bank? Well, let's see. Bank would serve as a way for government to collect the taxes. You put the money in the bank. That makes it safe because it's in a bank. And plus, if you have a bank, then you can lend money, etc., to other people, and then you can use the bank to help create paper currencies. Sounds logical. So Hamilton says we need a bank, a national bank. A national bank, that's actually not in the Constitution. We'll get to that in a second. He also has an issue with, we got to raise money, obviously, because we're in debt now, so we got to pay this back. So how are we going to raise money? Well, we're going to put some tariffs on various products. That's not going to go over very well. And he eventually comes up with an idea that says, I know, let's tax whiskey. Let's tax alcohol. Man, I hope you're paying attention on this slide. Oh, I hope you're paying attention on this slide. Put your phone down. Put your phone down. Here we go. Loose construction versus strict construction. Put your phone down. You got to hear this. This is important. Loose construction versus strict construction. Alexander Hamilton argued we have to have a bank. Thomas Jefferson said, yeah, I understand what you're saying, dude, but here's the deal. We can't form a bank because it wasn't written in the Constitution. We can't have a national bank. It wasn't in the Constitution to say you can form a bank. Thomas Jefferson says, look, according to the 10th Amendment, if it's not listed in the Constitution, it goes to the states. The states have banks. So we don't need to form a national bank. We already have banks, so therefore that debt, we can divide it amongst all the banks, and they can hold the money. And Alexander Hamilton said, no, you're reading that wrong, Jefferson. You're reading that wrong. It doesn't say anything about a bank in there. Therefore, pay attention. Therefore, if it doesn't say anything about a bank, that means it doesn't not say. It doesn't say you can't have a bank. It doesn't say you can't have a bank. Alexander Hamilton says, because it doesn't say we can't have one, therefore we can have one. Jefferson says, no, it doesn't say anything about a bank, so therefore we can't have. What? No, we can't have one. It's not in there. Alexander Hamilton says, you're right, it's not in there, therefore we can. Those are two different arguments. Loose construction. It's not written down, therefore it must be okay. Strict construction. It's not written down, therefore it's not okay. Clothing at what do we call that? The dress code at school. Dress code at school. It says specifically that you cannot expose your bare midriff, such your belly button. I mean, you might argue, don't argue this, but you could argue that if you take your hands and you cover your belly button, and you run up and down the hall naked, well, you're following dress code, because it says you cannot expose your bare midriff. So you cover your belly button with your hands and run up and down the hall. A loose constructionist would say, it doesn't say you can't be naked in the handbook. It doesn't actually say that. So therefore, it must be okay as long as you cover your belly button. A strict constructionist would say, it doesn't say you can't be naked, so therefore, you can't be naked. Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, they're going to argue. Now, Alexander Hamilton adds to his argument, and he says, look, it says in the Constitution, it says the Congress has the right to borrow and lend money. It has the ability to regulate trade and currency and to print money. That's what it says in the Constitution. Alexander Hamilton says, how can we do that if we don't have a bank, a national bank? These two argued and they argued and they argued and they argued, and we're still arguing, by the way, strict construction versus loose construction. We're still doing that in the year 2020. They argued and argued and argued about this, and they went to George Washington. George Washington said, I'm going to go with Alexander Hamilton, which really irritated Thomas Jefferson. So we got a bank, and George Washington signed off on it, and we're going to have a bank for the next 20 years because the bank has a charter, and we have to renew that charter every so often. And heads up, some of the presidents, they're not going to renew that charter. I wonder what's going to happen if we don't have a bank. Good times. Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson were so polarizing. They were so, they just could not stand each other, right? So they're going to form their factions. We're going to have Whigs and Tories. Whigs are anti-king, Tories pro-king. You got the Federalists, people who are pro-Constitution, anti-Federalists, who are people who did not like the Constitution. We've got, basically, it all boils down to, do you like Hamilton or do you not like Hamilton? Okay, right? So the Federalists, they're going to be led by Alexander Hamilton. They are going to support a strong central government. They want a national bank. They want federal judges to be in charge. They want trickle-down economics. Give money to the rich people, help the rich people out, then the rich people will be able to give the poor people jobs. And then everybody's happy. So that's the Federalist line. They're pro-manufacturing, they're pro-North, and they're going to be pro-Britain because we are trading goods with Britain. The Anti-Federalists, who we're now going to call the Democratic Republicans, isn't that weird? The Democratic Republicans, they're going to be led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. And they're going to be incredibly anti-Hamilton. So they're going to push for states' rights being more important than the national government. They don't want a national bank, they want state banks. They are more agrarian, they prefer the farmers over the manufacturers, and they tend to support the South more. The Democratic Republicans are also pro-France because they're pro-France. Let's see. Washington is going to try to remain neutral between the two different parties. Let's see how well he does. Speaking of France, they're going to be going on their own little revolution. A lot of people here in the United States are like, "Oh, we started that," and they just took it and they took the ball and ran with it. And so, whereas we kicked the king out, although the king never actually came over here, but we kicked the king out of our business, they actually took the king's head off over there. They're going to go through their situation. So in 1789 and a couple of years, and so they're going to have Robespierre and all their famous French revolutionaries who ultimately are going to get guillotined themselves. A lot of people see this as a lot of the people in the South, the Democratic Republicans, are going to see this as a extension of the American Revolution, and therefore we should help them out. Thomas Jefferson is actually going to be the author of the French Declaration of the Rights of Man, which is kind of, I don't want to say it's like the Declaration of Independence, but it's kind of like that. So Thomas Jefferson, our Secretary of State, is going to write that for the French. So you can see they're very close. They're very close. In 1792, it's going to spill over into different countries in Europe, and things are going to get crazy. Britain is going to get brought into it. Britain's going to go to war with France, and now we got a situation because we have the Federalists who are pro-British, and we have the anti-Federal, or the Democratic Republicans who are pro-French, and the French and the British are fighting each other. So Washington says, hey, I got a plan. Let's just be neutral. We're not pro-British or pro-French. Well, we're both, so therefore we're going to be neutral, and we're not going to become embroiled into Europe. We're going to stay out of Europe's business. Well, that's an interesting policy, Washington. I wonder how well that's going to work out. Let's see. Washington did not believe the U.S. could survive a European war economically or militarily or politically. Well, right, because we had just fought a war. We don't have that many people over here, just 4 million people. And yeah, we were gassed at this point because Washington said we need at least an entire generation of people so that we can build back up our forces, and this is not good. We're going to stay out of Europe. So we declared neutrality. We declared neutrality, which people like Thomas Jefferson was like, whoa, 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 whoa. We helped the French helped us out in our bid to overthrow the king. And now they're doing the same thing, and we're not going to help them out. And Washington said, no, we're not going to help them out. We're going to be neutral. An interesting little story within this, we have citizen Genet. So Genet was an ambassador from France, and he was told to come over here, come up to Philadelphia and see the president. Come up to Washington, D.C., see the President of the United States, and get him to change his mind. Get the Secretary of State and the United States of America to change his mind. So he's going to come directly to Washington, D.C. and plead with Thomas Jefferson and George Washington. Well, no, he didn't do that. Instead, he went to South Carolina first, and he got off the boat in Charleston, and he started rallying the people, the American people, to become pro-French. So he's passing out little French flags, and he's like, liberté, égalité, fraternité, and he's getting the people all psyched up to help out the French. He's also passing out papers and telling people, hey, kind of like how you helped out the Americans, or how we helped out the Americans, and you guys helped out the Americans, you privateers, pirates. You privateers will help. You can, be a privateer for the French and go over there, and here's a piece of paper, and you go over there and you can make some money. And so he's riling up the American people against the British to become pro-French, and he's doing this in Charleston. And as he comes north from Charleston, he goes through North Carolina and through Virginia, he's holding these rallies, and people are following him, and they're singing French songs, and everybody's very excited about this. And so the point is, he's going to arrive at the doorstep, and he's going to knock on the door, and Thomas Jefferson's going to let him in. And Genet says, all right, hey, I'm from France, and we're good buddies. And Jefferson's like, yeah, I understand that. And Genet says, so I'm just asking for you guys to renege on the neutrality issue and help us out. And Jefferson said, we can't do that. Genet says, why? Jefferson basically says, have you met the President of the United States? Here he is. Washington comes up and goes, hey, buddy, Genet. And Genet's like, oh, hi, Mr. President. Can you help? And Washington's like, here's the problem. If you'd come directly to me, I would have said no, because I'd already made my decision about neutrality. But here's what you did, buddy. You went behind my back. You started in South Carolina and riled up all my people. All of my people, dude. And now they're all freaking out. That's you, Genet, Ambassador Genet. So not just no, but definitely no. We're not helping you out. Genet leaves the room, and he goes and he starts arming ships, American ships, to go over to France. I mean, he totally ignores Washington. Washington, he gets his cabinet together, and when they find out about this, he gets his cabinet together, and they vote to remove Genet. Now, that's like literally just remove, not like remove, although I'm sure that actually came out. Alexander Hamilton, I'm sure, was like, but to remove him from ambassadorship. So Washington, eventually, they get a hold of Genet, and they said, dude, you're done. You're not the ambassador anymore. We don't recognize your credentials. And Genet says, and Washington says, In fact, we're going to kick you out. And Genet says, dude, if you kick me out and I go back to France as a failure, they're going to execute me. So can I please stay here? And Washington agreed to allow him to stay here. And he became American citizen Genet. It's a long story for just a short story that says, don't irritate Washington. All right. As we last left, Alexander Hamilton decided he was going to put a tax on whiskey, on alcohol. Well, here's the problem with this. Besides, it's a tax. Oh, taxation without representation. Oh, that doesn't work because they have representation in the American Congress. So, who is this tax against? Well, how is whiskey made? I'll pause. Some of you are like, I have no idea. Some of you are like, yeah, we make whiskey in the bathtub. Why would you make whiskey in the bathtub? Seriously, during the 1920s, they were making whiskey in bathtubs. We'll get to that as prohibition. It's a crazy time. So who are they targeting? Who do the people think that Hamilton's targeting? Well, clearly he's targeting the farmers. He's targeting the Democratic Republicans because you have to, make foodstuff. Whiskey comes out of foodstuff. You distill the foodstuff like potatoes and things like that. So this is not just a tax on bottles of whiskey, but whiskey is not just for drinking in the 1790s. Whiskey is also used as payment in some places, like, oh, I have an appendicitis, take my appendix. I can't pay you in any gold, but I can give you a bottle of whiskey, and I'm sure the doctor's like, oh, I like that kind of whiskey. So this was a big deal to tax the whiskey. And the farmers didn't like it, so they're going to rebel. Kind of like Daniel Shays did under the Articles of Confederation. He got a group of farmers together, and they went out and they freaked out a lot of people. And we didn't have a central government to go out there and stop him, which is one of the reasons the Articles fell apart. And here we have the Whiskey Rebellion people, and they're going to organize into a pretty good-sized group. And George Washington, the President of the United States, George Washington, got on his horse and led a small army up over the hill. Now, this is the first time and only time that the President of the United States of America is actually in a battle. And when I say a battle, I mean, can you imagine? It wasn't much of a battle. Here are a bunch of these whiskey farmers. And can you just imagine George Washington coming up over the hill on his horse, and here comes the American troops, and all those whiskey farmers are like, oh, that's Big Dog himself. We give up. Moral of the story, don't irritate George Washington. We've had this conversation. Oh, we're going to get into it. Britain. We are neutral. We are neutral. We are neutral. We are neutral. However, we are trading with France. I mean, since we're neutral, we're trading with everybody. And the British don't like us trading with France. So the British are going to start impressing our soldiers. And you're like, oh, like, what, do they do magic tricks? No, not that kind of impressment. Impressment here didn't go down like 3 definitions in the dictionary. Impressing means that they are taking our soldiers off our ships and putting them on their ships to work for them. So it's I don't want to argue it's slavery, but it is kind of like slavery. So taking a soldier off of a ship and putting them on your ship for them to work for you, that's called an impressment. And so the British are doing this, and we are not happy about this because those are Americans, and we are playing by the neutral rules, and the British are not playing by the neutral rules. So we're going to have to do something about that. So we are going to send John Jay. John Jay is going to be our Chief Justice, the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And since we don't have any court cases yet, he's doing nothing except twiddling his thumbs. So George Washington sends John Jay instead of Thomas Jefferson, because Thomas Jefferson doesn't like the British. So he sends John Jay, who's a Federalist, and is going to go over to England to negotiate. And he was basically told, you tell those guys we are not putting up with British impressments on our ships. Tell them, stop them. So John Jay goes over there, and he writes it. He gets a treaty written, and yeah, 1795, and he comes back and he hands it to George Washington. George Washington reads it and he goes, "Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me?" England, in the treaty, England is not going to leave the forts that we were trying to ask them nicely to get out. They're going to remain in there. The British are going to agree to pay for some of the ships that they took from us. They're going to pay for some of that. However, they're not going to agree to stop impressing our soldiers. Like they actually said that. We're not going to stop. We're not going to stop taking your people. Britain also got us, John Jay, to sign on the line that says, "We will pay Britain back for the debts that they incurred fighting us in the war for American independence." Can you imagine George Washington reading this treaty and John Jay has signed it? You know, Jay did not have a very good afternoon. A lot of people are upset about this treaty because it was an awful, awful, terrible treaty from our point of view. And Thomas Jefferson took that ball and he ran with it, and he got that published in newspapers, and people were screaming for the death of John Jay. In fact, there's a drawing right there of John Jay being burned in effigy, which means they make a big straw dummy of you and then they light it on fire. Woo! We're going to have a couple other treaties. PINCKNEY'S Treaty, which with Spain, and so PINCKNEY'S Treaty basically is going to allow, well, one, it's going to draw the line, an officially firm, instead of a dotted line or a zigzag line, it's official, a firm line between Spanish Florida and American Georgia. And so that's going to be official. But arguably, and obviously more importantly, we've got the situation down there in New Orleans. And Spain is going to realize that we're getting pretty big for our britches, and they don't want to, they don't want to have to deal with American Revolution stuff with Spain. And so Spain's going to agree to give us the ability to go through New Orleans and not get stopped. So now our farmers are going to be able to, on trans-Appalachian, so on this side of the Appalachian Mountains, we are going to then be allowed to take our stuff and float it down the Mississippi River without being stopped by Spain. Hey, good for us! So the Jay Treaty was awful, the Pinckney Treaty, we got the Grenville Treaty, we've got lots of different treaties, and it is going to help establish a little more defense for the United States, clear up some of the boundaries for us. Washington was elected president twice, and then on his, so that's 8 years, and on year 8, they started talking about, well, all right, we got another 4 more years, right, George? And George Washington said, guys, I'm done. I'm done. It's been fun, but, and again, George Washington setting a precedent for being president. He said, I think 8 years is enough for one person to be the president of the United States. I think that's how it's going to be. And he walked off into the sunset again. There were people, Federalist people, who literally wanted to elect President Washington as president for life at this point. They were that pro-George. And he walked away from it. So this is the second time he's walked away. The first time was when he was the general of the army and we won, and then he walked away and became a farmer. And here he is, a little bit older, and now he's done. And again, he could have been reelected and reelected and reelected and reelected and reelected. But he walked away. And so he stepped down. Let's see, that was 1796, his farewell address. He's going to die in 1799, so he would not have made it all the way through his next presidency, but it is what it is. A couple of things in his farewell speech that are pretty important. One, he said, guys, do not form political parties. Do not form political parties. Political parties are an anathema. They're evil. Do not, please, guys, I'm asking you. Don't form political parties. Of course, you know what happens. As soon as he steps down, political party. Part number 2. Guys, whatever you do, do not get involved in a war with Europe. Stay out of it. Stay neutral. Don't favor France over Britain. Don't favor Germany over the Netherlands. Don't favor anybody. Stay out of Europe. I wonder how long. I wonder how long it took us before we got involved in Europe again. Oh, not that long. So Washington, he gets on his horse and he rides off into the sunset. And then we have the election of 1796. The election of 1796, a lot of people thought it was going to be Hamilton versus Jefferson, which makes sense because they're the leaders of the two political parties that George Washington said, do not form. But then Hamilton, I think he realized that he was so polarizing that people either liked him or like literally hated him. In fact, he's going to be shot in a duel, right? Oh, that's coming up in the slides. So he thinks, maybe I shouldn't run, so we're going to have John Adams run, who's also a Federalist. Now, John Adams, he also rubbed people the wrong way, but it wasn't because of his policies, but because of his personality. He was kind of a little jerk. And some people claim that he was a monarchist, that he was pro-king, like he wanted to be a king. But if you look at his credentials, look at all the stuff that he's done, and so John Adams has, he's got some support behind him. And then he's going to run against Thomas Jefferson, who's going to be, so we have John Adams is a Federalist, and Thomas Jefferson's going to run on the Democratic-Republican ticket, and they are going to vie for the presidency of the United States, and Adams is going to win. Again, in the original, how they did this in the Constitution, the first place votes becomes president, and the second place votes becomes vice president. So we had the two leaders of the opposing political parties, president and vice president. I'm sure it's all going to work out just fine. One of the first things that John Adams had to deal with was, obviously France, right? His vice president, Thomas Jefferson, big friends with France. John Adams, not so much. He's more pro-British. So Adams is going to send a delegation over there to talk to one of the ambassadors over in France, and Mr. Talleyrand, Monsieur Talleyrand. Talleyrand is going to say, I would love to talk to your ambassadors, Ambassador X, Ambassador Y, Ambassador Z, and we know their names, but I'd love to talk to your ambassadors, but you're going to have to pay me a bribe. You're going to have to pay me a bribe for me to come to the room to actually negotiate with you. And so the American ambassadors are like, no, we're not paying a bribe to talk to, no. So they went back and they told John Adams. John Adams just kind of blew up about it, and he was all, talking smack about France. And in walks his vice president, Thomas Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson's like, oh, hey, how did our negotiations go with France? And John Adams, actually, now this is from John Adams's diaries and talking about it. He said that, so he told Thomas Jefferson, Thomas, it didn't work very well, so don't, we'll try it again. And Jefferson, he blew up on Adams. He said, you know what, you and your stupid ambassadors, and, you intentionally are sabotaging the whole thing, and, if I was president, then And Adams was like, Jefferson, no, seriously, let it go. And Jefferson's like, and just because you're telling me to let it go tells me that you're the one, and you're the reason. And Adams finally said, hey, Jefferson, your buddy over in France, Talleyrand, he asked for a bribe. And Jefferson's like, oh, sorry. Kind of embarrassing. The quasi-war, we did have a quasi. Quasi means that we didn't actually declare a war. A quasi-war with France. Nothing really happened. U.S. prepared for war. Navy Department. The Navy Department was created. Marines are going to be reinstated. And we're going to cancel all treaties with France. And we're going to seize a couple of ships. And that's it. The Convention of 1800. We're all going to go back to normal because France has a new sheriff in town. His name is Napoleon Bonaparte. back in the home front, John Adams is receiving quite a few nasty letters in the mail, and or in the newspapers, and or in books, and so he and Congress, and these are very Federalist heavy Congress, they're going to pass a couple of laws that today will get you in trouble. What is that? Well, I say that. The Alien and Sedition Acts. So let's see. The Alien Act says that instead of you can become a citizen after 5 years, they pushed that to 14 years. Well, why would John Adams do that? Well, if you have a lot of people who are coming over from, say, for example, France, and they want to come over here and then vote for the new president, if they're only here for 5 years, then they can vote for Jefferson, and the next president, pretty much. But if they have to be over here for 14 years, by that time they'll all become Americanized, and they'll figure out the Federalists are the way to go. It's an interesting idea, right? So, I mean, he's targeting people. Also, the president is given the power to kick people out that he doesn't like. During peacetime or wartime, the president can remove people from our shores. The Alien Act. Huh. Interesting. The Sedition Act. So sedition is when you're talking smack about somebody. John Adams was sick of it. Man, he was tired of just getting ripped up and down in the press. And so Congress passed a rule that said you cannot write anything negative about the president if it's not true. So all this stuff about John Adams being, and people call him his rotundancy. Rotund means you're fat. His rotundancy, like King rotundancy, and all that kind of stuff. Well, if you could prove he was fat, then but just saying it to say it is going to be against the rules, against the law, the Sedition Act. And I know some of you are like, First Amendment? Right. And so that was used to silence his critics, and so when you tell people they can't say certain things, all right, moving on. So Jefferson, he walks out. He's still vice president, but he's just going to leave. He's going to leave Washington, D.C. John Adams is the first one to have a White House. The White House is built during John Adams. The end of George Washington's term, John Adams is the first one to live there. Jefferson, he decides, you know what? I'm not playing anymore. So he leaves and he goes back to Virginia, right across the river, but goes back to Monticello. And he and James Madison, also from Virginia, they're going to write some resolutions, the Kentucky Resolution and the Virginia Resolution. And so because Madison is already writing the Virginia Resolution, Jefferson writes the Kentucky Resolution, and the short version of these resolutions says, if the federal government, John Adams, if the federal government passes a law that the states don't like, that the states believe is anti to the Constitution, states don't have to follow the rule. If the states believe the law does not follow the Constitution, the states don't have to follow the law. Huh. That's the Vice President of the United States saying that. Here's your last slide for the first video. Short version is that's the Federalist, and that's the Federalist, and that's the Anti-Federalist today. The Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. That's what we call them. Big government, big central government, big state government. Wealthy should get taxed. Helps out the poor. Help the poor out, which will ultimately help out the wealthy. Pro-Britain, pro-France, pro-manufacturing, pro-farmers, pro-strong military, pro-people. And there you have the differences in a nutshell. All right, that's video number 1. We'll get to video number 2 and the Jefferson and Madison presidencies in just a little bit. Be good.